Page 15. Perception. All knowledge begins with perception, the initial form of the will's consciousness. Perception is the conscious act through which the will visualizes an object in its simplest appearance without relation to any other object. It is the first psychological fact in the operation of the will's consciousness, totally unrelated to logical factors. The logical factor enters when coordination of a number of perceptions is attempted in order to attain the desired concept of a given object. It is necessary to bear in mind that the term will must always be considered in its concrete force as the self-conscious and self-sentient will. In its perceiving activity, the will experiences three spheres of objects clearly distinguishable with respect to their specific importance and the influence with which they bear on our mentality. They are the superspiritual, spiritual, and natural spheres constantly present in the cosmic order. The superspiritual sphere causes perceptions of worthiness and value, the most outstanding and incontrovertible elements around which our whole life fundamentally circles, and by virtue of which it is intrinsically estimated and judged. The spiritual sphere causes perception of volitional, conscience, and sentimental factors, which contain neither superspiritual laws in their essence nor mechanical characteristics so obvious in the forces of nature. The natural sphere causes perceptions of automatic forces and automatic expressions or forms, which the autonomous will uses as external conditions of its life. There is neither superspiritual lawfulness nor self-conscious and self-sentient autonomous life in the essence of nature. The definition of the three spheres is correct not only from the ontological but also from the empirical viewpoint. Manifestations of these spheres are constantly obvious in our deeds, thoughts, and sentiments and cannot be logically omitted in psychological investigations. They constitute the basic realities of the soul's life with which the will is intrinsically concerned and without the recognition of which psychology is unable to extradite itself from the one-sided narrow limitations of subjectivistic espinology and sentimental emotionalism. The soul expresses its life through its relation to the whole objective cosmic order and cannot be understood without this obvious contact. It is therefore necessary to view the soul in its lawful cosmic environment in order to attain a concrete insight into the lawful spiritual structure and into its position in the cosmic order. In addition to this cosmological background of life, the psychological attitude of each soul coming upon this earth must also be duly considered in order to attain a profounder insight into its spiritual tendency. On arrival, the soul is not a blank tablet, as superficially appears, but a self-conscious and self-sentient agent, having a more or less clearly expressed disposition and tendency of will, which with each successive year becomes more pronounced. Were the soul of a child a blank tablet, parental education of its specific character and knowledge would be decisive. It is only influential. Each request is met either with consent or opposition on the child's part, clearly revealing its self-conscious and self-sentient will. Regardless of how indistinctly the tendency of a child may manifest itself, it is undoubtedly there. It is the seeking, choosing, and deciding tendency of the will in the inexperienced state of its new life. From what state of life the soul comes to this earth and to what state it is transferred after death is strictly not a psychological but rather a religious and ontological matter in which eternal justice and personal worthiness are the deciding factors. Yet psychology, though predominantly concerned with the forces and forms of the soul, insistently points to past and future personal life as a lawful necessity for its cosmological, axiological, and logical substantiation. This particular matter will receive due attention throughout this work. In the perceiving act, the will either seeks after or chooses those perceptions which accord with its predispositional tendency and personal interest. Unless some important or unusual occurrence deflects this tendency, the will remains preoccupied with these perceptions, which may be formed into the specific concept adaptable to its determination. All other perceptions caused by surrounding objects are generally unheeded or exert passive influence only. Consequently, perceptions pertaining to natural facts, which are the outstanding perceptions of the human mentality in general, clearly indicate the predominant interest of man in that nature which surrounds him. Although fully conscious and sentient of the fact that he has the force of will to choose and decide, as well as of the consciousness and feeling of the object in view, his interest in the material or physical sphere by far exceeds his interest in the spiritual or psychic sphere. This is a state of mental childhood in which man is as yet unable clearly to see and fully to recognize his own spiritual essence, and in consequence of this unenlightened condition, unable rationally to develop his spiritual forces. For nature surely is not the aim of a spiritual agent, but only the external condition of its life, a fact which proves itself in our daily experience. Perceptions of spiritual factors are as general and more important than perceptions pertaining to nature. In this mental contact, the perceiving soul is interested not only in the perceived object, but also in the inward relation to an object that has the same general characteristics and a similar existential condition and importance as to its own ego. Such free conscious and sentient relationship does not exist in nature. It lies in the essence of all things to tend toward their own intrinsic likeness. Such adherence among natural objects is mechanically lawful, but adherence among spiritual agents, though super-spiritually lawful, is psychologically volitional. If, therefore, the will's tendency leans towards spiritual facts, as it does more or less frequently even in souls with no educational attainments, perceptions of spiritual facts are bound to evoke the introspective tendency whereby the thinking subject gradually arrives at a profounder self-cognition than through habitual observation of natural objects. It is invariably the habitual interest in a given object that enhances the tendency toward that object. Perceptions pertaining to superspiritual elements are as general as the others. Their function in our consciousness is to dominate all perceptions relative to spirituality and nature. They point to the worthiness of deeds and to the value of natural things. They are factors, therefore, which are of fundamental interest in our spiritual life. All perceptions pertaining to the superspiritual, spiritual, and natural spheres stand in constant relation to the appearing object. If an object does not appear in or impress our consciousness, perception is non-existent. This psychological fact clearly contradicts the denial of spiritual and superspiritual objectivity. It is the first appearance of objects in consciousness which causes their phenomenal character. Hence, phenomena, to whatever sphere they may belong, are always hypothetical and require rational scrutiny to determine their reality and their value. We plainly see that the earth is flat, that the sun circles around the earth, and that we are always on top of the earth, etc., none of which is true according to the laws of nature. Likewise, we frequently take subjective concepts and experiences as criterions of truth, sentiments, and emotions for will, psychological motives for logical causes, ontological and psychological factors for logical categories, etc., all contrary to logic and reason. We accept the appearance of good or evil deeds as real and often ground our judgment on them, although these appearances may prove neither the reason for nor the motive of the deed. Yet, regardless of how hypothetical the character of our perception or how preponderant our habitual attention to one sphere or another, superspiritual, spiritual, or natural, these trends clearly indicate the tendency of the will with respect to the spheres of life. These tendencies, however, are not psychologically three essentially separate perceptions. Perception is always one and the same introductory cognitive act and the first mental fact in consciousness, through which the will reveals its interest in the given object. Only in an objective sense is it logically admissible to speak of superspiritual, spiritual, and natural perceptions. The essential relation of the volitional force of the soul to consciousness lies in the fact that the will searches perceptions, chooses concepts, and determines the complex of ideas. End of section. Page 19. Concept. Perceptions are simple or elementary psychological functions in consciousness. Concepts, however, are more or less logical products through which the will endeavors to attain a broader and profounder comprehension of things perceived. Thus, perceptions constitute the ideational material out of which concepts are formed. To produce a logical concept, however, requires first psychological aptitudes of intuition, experience, discrimination, and imagination, and second, knowledge of logical laws and categories with their inherent forms of discrimination. Without these mental conditions, discussion about logical concepts are too abstract to be of practical value, for concepts are not only ideational, but also determinative products and, as such, psychologically dependent on the will which endeavors to attain them. Furthermore, it is necessary to bear in mind that neither intuition and experience nor discrimination and imagination are essential forces of the soul, as they are so often erroneously considered. They are rather mental dispositions or aptitudes of the soul, the psychological ways through which the will expresses its mental tendency. Their designation as forces may be used in a loose sense only. The soul has no other essential forces than will, consciousness, and feeling. The self-conscious and self-sentient will, however, avails itself of intuition, a conscious sensibility through which it endeavors to learn of experience, which it accepts or rejects, of logical discrimination in order to find truth, and of natural images to attain and convey tangible representation of its ideas. Since these aptitudes play a very important part in the formation of concepts, a preliminary explanation of each is necessary in order to attain concrete insight into the psychological process of human concepts. We shall therefore discuss first the psychological qualifications and second the logical requirements for concepts. End of section, The Force of Consciousness.